I have told this story many times now, always to men who laugh at first and grow quiet by the end. I have told it to Thornwall himself, who has the audacity to pretend he does not remember the expression on his own face, and I have told it to his wife, who does remember and who never once lets him forget it. I am Elliot Vane. I was there. And I will tell you what happened the afternoon the cold Duke of Thornwall walked into the wrong room, and the world as we both knew it ended. It was the midsummer house party of 1852, and Thornwall Park in those years was a place designed entirely for the performance of magnificence. Lord Adrian Thornwall, 6th Duke of Thornwall, had inherited not only the title and the land, but the exhausting tradition of gathering, every July, some 40 guests of impeccable lineage and almost no charm, and housing them for a fortnight in rooms that cost more to heat than most men earned in a decade. Adrian bore this obligation as he bore most things, with complete composure and a kind of bleak efficiency that the county took for haughtiness, and which I, who had known him since we were 15 years old, understood to be nothing more sinister than the face of a man who found very little worth pretending about. He was not cold. That is the thing I most want you to understand, because everyone else got it wrong from the beginning. The papers called him the Cold Duke. The guests behind their fans called him worse. But I had ridden beside him through 2 seasons of grief, his father's death, his mother's slow decline, and I knew the warmth he kept below the surface like coal kept below the earth, waiting for the right kind of pressure to bring it up. He simply had not found the right kind of pressure yet. I arrived at Thornwall Park on the Tuesday before the party proper began, in time to watch the household prepare. 40 rooms to ready, 40 sets of expectations to meet, and somewhere beneath all of that machinery of ceremony, the domestic staff moving through the service corridors like a separate civilization entirely. I noticed the seamstress on the Wednesday afternoon, because she nearly walked into me in the east corridor while carrying an armful of ivory satin so tall she could not see over the top of it. She said with great composure, "I beg your pardon, sir," stepped sideways, and continued on her way without waiting to see whether I might be important. I was not particularly, but I was curious. I asked the housekeeper, Mrs. Pentick, who she was. Mrs. Pentick said she was Miss Nora Ashby, engaged from the dressmaker in the village to do repairs and alterations for the lady guests throughout the party, as 3 of the expected arrivals had sent word of last-minute disasters involving their evening gowns. Miss Ashby had been given a room in the east wing, the far end, past the last guest chamber, where the corridor turned toward the old lumber room. I thought no more of it. Thursday came, and 40 guests came with it, and the great hall of Thornwall Park filled with silk and conversation, and the particular variety of cruelty that the English aristocracy deploys at close quarters and calls good manners. Adrian, to his credit, endured it without flinching. He greeted each guest with exactly the degree of warmth their rank demanded. He presided over dinner with the quiet authority that had always been his greatest social tool, and he retired at exactly 10:20, which I knew because I had been counting the minutes myself. I found him in the library an hour later, sitting with his coat off and a glass of brandy and a book he had not opened. "Which of them has annoyed you most?" I asked. He considered. Lord Pelham's youngest son asked me whether I had considered improving the Northfield drainage by a method he had read about in a pamphlet. "Terrible." He quoted the pamphlet at me for 11 minutes. "Devastating," I said. "Go to bed, Adrian, it gets no better sitting up." He went, I finished my brandy and did the same. On Friday morning, the trouble began. It began, as all great trouble does, with a perfectly reasonable mistake. The east wing of Thornwall Park had been rearranged some years before, when Adrian's father had ordered a set of interior doors fitted to allow what he grandly called a more natural passage between the guest chambers and the service rooms. The result was a corridor that branched twice in ways that confounded nearly everyone who did not live there full time. I had navigated it successfully for 11 years only, because I had once been locked in a linen cupboard for 40 minutes at the age of 23, and had never forgotten the layout since. Adrian had not had occasion to use the east wing in some time. His own rooms were in the west. He had gone east on Friday morning for one reason only. His valet, Bertram, had taken a pair of his riding boots to a room near the lumber store to waterproof them with a compound that smelled, Bertram had warned him, quite powerfully, and should not be opened in an enclosed space. Bertram had been attending to a guest's broken spur at the time, and had asked His Grace to fetch the boots himself, which His Grace had agreed to without blinking, because Adrian Thornwall had never once in his life made a fuss about fetching his own boots. The boots were in a room at the end of the east corridor, past the second branching, on the right. At least they were supposed to be. What was on the right at the second branching, on a Friday morning in July, was Miss Nora Ashby's workroom, which was also her sleeping room, because the house was full in a state of considerable activity. She had Lady Pelham's evening gown pinned to a dress form near the window. She herself was standing at the long table with her back to the door, pinning a seam, and she was wearing her working clothes. A plain dark skirt, a linen blouse with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, her hair pinned up but already escaping in the heat of a room with a south-facing window. Adrian opened the door, registered none of this immediately because he was still looking down at the handle to make sure the latch had caught, and said, "Bertram, I hope that smell has gone because—" He looked up. She turned around. The pause that followed was, by my later estimation, approximately 4 seconds. I know this because I happened to be walking past the corridor entrance at that precise moment, heard the door open, heard Adrian's voice, heard it stop, and paused in the corridor myself to listen, because 11 years of friendship with the man had given me an instinct for disaster the way a farmer develops an instinct for rain. Miss Nora Ashby did not scream. She did not faint. She looked at him for those 4 seconds with the expression of someone who has just discovered something unexpected and is deciding rapidly what to think about it. Then she said calmly, "You are not Bertram." "No," said Adrian. "I apologize, I had the wrong." He looked at the door. He looked at the number on the door. He looked at the number on the door for a moment too long, because clearly the number was not the one he had expected, and he was working out where he had gone wrong. "I had the wrong room. I beg your pardon." "The room you want," said Miss Ashby, setting down her pins with the air of someone who has not time to waste being flustered, "is past the second turning, not before it. On the left, not the right. The numbers are misleading. Mrs. Pentic knows and has meant to have them corrected for some time." There was another pause, briefer. "Thank you," said Adrian. "You are welcome, Your Grace." He went. I heard his footsteps down the corridor, measured and unhurried. I stayed where I was. Half a minute later, I heard a door open near me, and Mrs. Hartley, wife to one of the guests, a woman of formidable social appetite who had once told me she considered herself the living record of everything worth knowing in the county, appeared from the guest chamber that abutted, as I now realized with some alarm, the wall of Miss Ashby's workroom. She looked at me, she looked at the corridor, she looked at the direction from which Adrian had just come. I saw the exact moment she decided to draw a conclusion. I said, "Good morning, Mrs. Hartley." She said, "Good morning, Mr. Vane," in the tone of someone saving a delicious morsel for later, and went briskly toward the staircase. By luncheon, it was everywhere. Not said outright. It was never said outright in those rooms in those years. It was present in the way conversations shifted when Adrian entered, in the way Lady Pelham found something very interesting to look at above his left shoulder when he spoke to her, in the way Lord Pelham's youngest son stopped quoting pamphlets at him and looked at him with something between admiration and apprehension. It was in the particular quality of silence that fell at the far end of the dining table when someone whose name I did not catch said something just too quiet to hear, and 3 women laughed. I found Adrian in the billiard room after luncheon, alone, holding a cue he was not using. "You know," I said. "Mrs. Pentic informed me." He set the cue against the table with great care. She was kind enough to also tell me that Mrs. Hartley has given her interpretation of events to at least 6 people before noon. That is Mrs. Hartley's interpretation, not the fact. The interpretation and the fact are in this house the same thing by dinner. He looked at the billiard table for a moment. The girl is a seamstress. She is here to work. She has done nothing wrong, and she will bear the weight of a story she had no part in making. I said nothing because I knew this tone. It was not the cold Duke speaking. It was Adrian Thornwall, who had a code he never explained to anyone and never violated, and who would not go to dinner tonight until he had found a way to make this right. "I will speak to her," he said. "What will you say?" He thought about it. "I don't know yet." He knocked on the workroom door at 3 o'clock, which I knew because I was, by this point, making no pretense of being anywhere else. He knocked. She said, "Come in." He went in, and I stood in the corridor and listened, which is a habit I am not proud of but which has served me extremely well. He said, "Miss Ashby, I owe you an apology and more than an apology." She said, "You owe me nothing, Your Grace. You entered the wrong room by an honest mistake, which I witnessed, and which reflects no particular credit or discredit on anyone." A pause. "Mrs. Hartley," he said, "has formed a different view." Another pause, this one with a different quality to it. "Ah," said Miss Ashby, and that single syllable told me she had known since this morning, and had been waiting to see whether anyone of consequence would bother to address it. "I intend to address it," Adrian said, as though she had spoken that thought aloud. "I am not certain of the most graceful method. I came to ask what you would prefer." I had known Adrian Thornwall for 11 years, and I had never once heard him ask a woman in Miss Ashby's position what she would prefer. I had never heard him ask most men in most positions what they would prefer. It was not arrogance. It was simply that he generally knew what needed to be done and did it, and consulting others on the matter struck him as inefficient. That he was consulting her meant something, though I could not have told you then precisely what. She said, "I would prefer that it went away quietly, which it will not. I would prefer to continue my work and leave at the end of the fortnight with my reputation intact, which is now unlikely. I would prefer that none of this had happened at all." A brief silence. "As none of those are available options, I am prepared to accept whatever solution you think best, Your Grace, because you are in a considerably stronger position than I am to impose one." He said, "That is exactly the kind of generosity I am least comfortable accepting." She said, and I could hear something different in her voice now, not the composed practicality of before, but something drier, a little edged. "I am not offering it out of generosity. I am offering it out of arithmetic. I have two choices. I may be indignant and uncooperative and leave this house today with no character reference and no fee, or I may be practical and cooperative and leave with whatever solution you impose. I am choosing the practical option. This is not virtue, Your Grace. It is mathematics." There was a pause longer than any of the others. He said, "You are remarkably straightforward." She said, "I am remarkably busy. I have Lady Pelham's gown to finish by 6. He said, "I won't keep you. I will think of something." He came out of the room, closed the door with great care, and stood in the corridor for a moment. He looked at me. I had given up all pretense of being elsewhere and was standing approximately 4 feet away. He said, "She is not what I expected." I said, "What did you expect?" He thought about it. Tears, probably, recrimination, gratitude if not tears or recrimination. "She gave you mathematics," I said. "Yes," he looked at the closed door. "She is right about her position. If I do nothing, she leaves here at the end of the fortnight with the story following her. Mrs. Hartley does not keep things to the county." He was quiet for a moment. "There is a solution." "I can see where this is going," I said. "It is the only clean solution. It is also a rather permanent one." He said, "Yes," in the tone of a man not entirely dismayed by the permanence. He went back in. I followed because I was his closest friend, and I flatly refused to miss this. She was at the dress form again, adjusting a pin with the focused economy of someone who does not look up from her work, unless there is a very good reason. She glanced at us both, at me with mild surprise, at Adrian with the wary neutrality of someone who has already had one unexpected visit today and is prepared for most things. He said, "I have thought of a solution. I wanted to put it to you rather than impose it." She set down the pin. "That sounds ominous." "Not ominous, simply unorthodox." He stood very straight. "I propose that we give Mrs. Hartley the story she wants, not the story she currently has, but a better one, a formal one." She looked at him. "I don't follow you." "If it were known," he said carefully, "that I had called on you not by accident but by intention, that this morning had been anticipated, then the story changes. You are not a woman caught in a compromising situation. You are a woman being courted by the Duke of Thornwall." The silence this time was complete. She said, "You're proposing to court me." "In form," he said, "to protect your reputation. An announcement this evening at dinner, brief, no detail required, would change the entire complexion of what Mrs. Hartley believes she witnessed. You would leave this house not under a cloud but as my betrothed, and once at a sufficient distance from Thornwall Park, the engagement might be quietly." Dissolved, she said. Concluded, he said, with my sincere regret for the record. She was quiet for a long time. I watched her face. It was an unusual face, not beautiful in the way the 40 guests in the great rooms below were beautiful, not dressed for display or arranged for admiration. It was a face that thought, and showed it thinking. The small line between her brows, the set of her mouth, the way her gaze moved to the window and came back to him with something that was not warmth exactly, but was something warmer than what had been there before. She said, "You would do this for a seamstress." "I would do this for any woman in this house who had been put in this position through my error," he said. "The fact that you are a seamstress is precisely why I owe it." She said, "And you would not find it objectionable, the form of it." "I find this entire situation objectionable," he said, "and you are the least objectionable part of it." She looked at him for a moment longer. Then something shifted in her face. Not a smile, not quite, but the approach of one, the preparatory movement before the thing itself. She said, "Lady Pelham's gown will be ready by 6. He said, "I'm glad to hear it." She said, "I will require a moment this evening to change before dinner." He said, "Of course." She said, "Then I accept your proposal, Your Grace, in form." "In form," he agreed. He bowed a proper bow, not the quarter nod he gave the 40 guests below, and walked out. In the corridor, he stopped and stood still for a moment with his hands clasped behind his back, looking at nothing in particular. I stood beside him. He said, "Don't." I said, "I haven't said anything." "You were about to." "I was going to observe," I said, "that in 11 years I have never once seen you consult a woman about her own preferences in a matter that concerned her, and that I find the phenomenon interesting." He said, "She presented me with mathematics. It would have been inefficient not to take them into account." "Of course," I said. "She is very practical," he said. "She is," I agreed. "And direct," he said. "Notably so," I said. He turned and walked toward the west wing. I followed and said nothing further because he was wearing the expression of a man already revising a calculation. At dinner he announced it plainly. He had that afternoon proposed to Miss Ashby, the lady engaged for the alterations, and she had done him the honor of accepting. He said it in the tone he used for estate business, clear, unhurried, leaving no room for amendment. 40 faces arranged themselves into 40 variations of the same expression, which was the expression of people who had been given a story and were deciding what to make of it. The first moment of silence lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then Lord Pelham cleared his throat, and Lady Pelham said, "How perfectly charming," in the tone of someone who has found the flavor of a dish not quite to their expectation, but has decided to swallow it regardless. Mrs. Hartley looked across the table at Miss Ashby, who had come to dinner in a dark gown that was plain and perfectly fitted, and which I strongly suspected she had made herself. And Mrs. Hartley's face went through several rapid transitions before arriving at something that resembled, under the pressure of 29 witnesses, the shape of approval. Lord Pelham's youngest son looked at Adrian with an expression I can only describe as profound bewilderment, as if the pamphlet he had been preparing to quote next had turned out to contain information he had not expected. He opened his mouth once and thought better of it and closed it again. I was grateful to him for that. Miss Ashby received the attention of the table with the same composure she had given everything else today. She sat straight. She met every eye that sought hers. She said, "Thank you," when it was required, and said nothing when it was not. She was seated at Adrian's right hand, which was where he had put her, which was not where anyone had expected a seamstress to sit. I watched her handle her first course with complete steadiness, which is not the easiest thing to do when you are aware that 39 people are watching you choose a fork. She chose the correct one without hesitation and ate without self-consciousness, and I found myself thinking that whatever the workroom and the mathematics had made of her, it had made her level. She was not performing serenity. She had it. Adrian spoke to her twice during the meal, once about something practical relating to the arrangements for the following morning, and once about something I could not hear, to which she replied with 3 words that made the faint line at the corner of his mouth that served, in his particular economy of expression, as a smile. I had not seen that line all week. I noted its appearance with considerable interest. After dinner in the drawing room, she sat near the window while the other women came to offer their congratulations. I watched her navigate them, the curiosity dressed as warmth, the condescension dressed as cordiality, and she navigated them as she had navigated everything else today, practically composedly without giving an inch. Lady Pelham stopped beside her for a full 3 minutes, which in Lady Pelham's economy of social attention was practically an eternity. I could not hear the particulars, but I saw Miss Ashby listen, and nod, and respond with something measured, and Lady Pelham leave the exchange looking not warmer exactly, but perhaps slightly less cold. It was, for Lady Pelham, a notable thaw. Adrian stood near the fireplace and watched her, and he wore the expression of a man who has set something in motion, and is now watching it move and finding, to his very great surprise, that he does not want it to stop. I came to stand beside him. He said, without looking away from her, "She is managing them very well." "She is," I said. "She is not frightened." "No," I said. He said, "When she spoke to me today in the workroom, she said that her choice was arithmetic, that she was choosing the practical option." "I remember," I said. "But she did not have to accept this version of it," he said. "I gave her an option that complicated matters considerably for her, required her to appear at a dinner table among 40 people who would watch her, to accept an offer from a man she had spoken to twice, to occupy a position that was not natural to her and that would draw every eye in the room." He paused. "She accepted anyway." "She trusted that your intention was what you said it was," I said. He was quiet for a moment. I should have liked to deserve that trust before it was given. I said nothing. Below us, on the other side of the room, Miss Ashby had finished with the last well-wisher and turned back toward the window, and the candlelight caught the side of her face, the line of her jaw, the faint tiredness around her eyes that she was carrying with great dignity. And Adrian Thornwall looked at her the way I had never seen him look at anything, with a kind of attention that was not calculation and not assessment, but something older and quieter than either. I thought, there it is. There is the pressure that brings the coal up. He crossed the room. I watched him sit beside her in the second chair near the window, watched the small moment of surprise in her face when he chose that chair over the dozen others available, watched him say something quiet to which she replied with something equally quiet, watched neither of them look away. They spoke for most of the remaining evening. I do not know what was said. I was not there, even I have limits. I did observe that they remained beside that window long after the other guests had drifted to cards or to pianoforte or to the kind of quiet, malicious conversation that fills the late hours of country house parties. I observed that Miss Ashby, who had been erect and composed since she walked into the room, relaxed fractionally as the evening went on, not a collapse of composure, nothing so dramatic, merely a slight easing of the shoulders, a quality of attention that was less guarded. I observed that Adrian, who did not lean forward when he spoke to people, had by 9:30 leaned forward twice. What I know of the conversation is what Adrian told me the following morning, which was that he had asked her about her work, and she had told him about it, honestly and specifically, without diminishing it or dressing it up, and he had found this so unlike every conversation he had had for the last 3 days, and quite possibly for the last 3 years, that he had lost all track of time. He said she had described the way a gown was constructed from the inside, the architecture of it, the systems of bones and stitching that made the exterior possible, and she had spoken about it as a craftsman speaks about a craft that is genuinely interesting to them, without apology and without performance. He said he had asked her how long she had been sewing, and she had said since she was 8, when her mother had taught her because they could not afford to have their mending done elsewhere, and it had turned out she was good at it, and good at it had become, over time, something she was proud of. He said he had told her this was not so different from how he had learned to manage an estate, which was that no one had taught him properly, and he had been obliged to become good at it out of sheer necessity. And she had looked at him then with a kind of recalibration that he had recognized, because it was the same look he was giving her. He said she did not say what she was thinking. But I knew what she was thinking. I said, what was she thinking? He said that I was not what she expected. I said, what had she expected? He considered for a moment, and then he said, with the directness that had always been his dominant quality when he bothered to deploy it, someone easier to dismiss. What she told me when I asked her some months later was that he had asked her what she would have done if he had not offered his particular solution. She had told him she would have finished Lady Pelham's gown, collected her fee, and gone home, and found another position elsewhere because that was simply what one did. He had looked at her when she said this with an expression she could not entirely interpret, and then he had said, "And if there were a position here? A permanent one, in some official capacity?" She said she had looked at him for a long time before answering. He said, "I am aware this is the third time in one day I have surprised you." She said, "It is the fourth, actually. The first was the door." He said, "Ah, yes." She said, "You are asking me not to let the engagement dissolve." He said, "I am asking whether in your calculation there is an arithmetic by which that would make sense." She had thought about it for a moment, the window dark by then, the room behind them thinning as the guests retired, the candles burning low, and said, "I would need to revise my original figures." "Of course," he said. "I had not accounted for the possibility," she said, "that the solution might also be the thing I wanted." He had taken her hand then, properly, carefully, as though it were something worth being careful with. She had let him, and the arithmetic, she told me, resolved itself quite cleanly from that point. In the weeks that followed, he called on her in the village, not as performance, not for the benefit of Mrs. Hartley or the 40 guests who had since returned to their various estates and their various interpretations of what they had witnessed at Thornwall Park, but because she was there, and because he had discovered that the conversations he had in her company were the only conversations in his recent memory that had not felt, at some point, like labor. She met him without ceremony. She offered him tea, she showed him the shop where she worked, she spoke to him about the orders she was filling and the difficulty of obtaining good wool from the new supplier and the particular challenge of altering a gown for a woman who gave incorrect measurements, and then blamed the seamstress for the result. He listened with the same quality of attention he gave to estate accounts, which was to say complete and undivided, and he asked questions that told her he had been listening to what she said the previous time as well. She told me later that it was the questions that decided her. Not the title, not the house, not the particular way he looked at her in the drawing room with the candles burning low, though she was honest enough to admit that these had not been entirely without effect. It was the questions, the fact that he remembered what she had told him and wanted to know more. "He treated what I said as though it were worth knowing," she said. "That is not as common as it ought to be." I thought and did not say that he had been hungry for the same thing from her, someone who told him the truth and expected him to treat it accordingly. Two people who had each found, in an entirely unexpected corner of the other's life, the thing they had not realized they were looking for. The engagement, which had begun as a solution, became over those weeks entirely itself. They were married in September, in the church at Thornwall, which was not large enough for 40 guests but held the people who mattered, which was all it needed to do. I stood beside him at the altar. She came in wearing ivory, made herself, as I had suspected, because she said she knew better than anyone how a gown ought to fit, and she was not wrong. She walked without ceremony, without drama, without the particular performance that the occasion seemed to invite. Just a woman in an ivory gown walking toward the man who had walked into the wrong room and found, against every expectation, exactly where he was supposed to be. He took her hand at the altar and held it the way he had held it in the drawing room, as though it were something worth being careful with. And the cold Duke of Thornwall, whom the county had called calculating, severe, incapable of feeling, looked at Nora Ashby with the entirety of what he had been keeping below the surface for 38 years. And she looked back at him with the mathematics of a woman who has revised her figures and found them better than she planned. And the vicar said the words, and it was done. I have told this story many times. The men laugh at first at the door, and then they go quiet by the end because they hear what it is underneath the comedy of it, a man who walked into the wrong room and had the honesty to stay. Thornwall told me once when I pressed him on the subject that he had known by the fourth conversation. I said, "Which fourth conversation?" And he said, "In the workroom." When she said it was mathematics, I said, "You knew then?" And he said, "I knew there was a woman in this house who would tell me the truth and that I had been hungry for that for rather a long time." And then he said, in the tone he used when he considered a matter fully resolved, "She was right, of course, it was mathematics. I simply had better data by the end of the evening." I have thought about that often, about what it costs a man to keep his warmth below the surface for long enough, and what it takes. Sometimes a wrong turn, sometimes an open door, sometimes a woman who gives you arithmetic when you expected tears to bring it up at last. And every time I think of it, I think of Nora Ashby at the dress form with her pins, not turning around more than once, deciding in 4 seconds what to think and choosing, practical. And every time, I think she chose right.